So, would you want to be immortal? Immortality is a superpower gifted to many different fantasy creatures throughout legend. The immortal vampires, the long-lived elves, etc. Deities of all kinds always come standard with some immortality. But what does that really mean? To be immortal, to live forever? Today we're going to have a look at some of the stories surrounding immortality and what it means to be an immortal, with sometimes too many downsides to really enjoy it at all. So, gather around the fire and let me tell you a tale. Immortality has been the subject of a myriad of stories, but very few of them ever end in a happily ever after. There is no one-size-fits-all when it comes to eternal life. There are many ways to both become immortal and many ways to be immortal. The most harrowing of them is immortality while you still continue to age. That doesn't quite sound like immortality, I hear you say, but it is. It just doesn't come packaged with eternal youth, which is a problem. In ancient Greek mythology, we find a man named Tithonus, a prince of Troy. The goddess of dawn, Eos, fell in love with this beautiful man, but as she was a goddess and he was merely immortal, she knew they could never be together forever. He would grow old and die while she lived on. So she decided to ask Zeus for a boon. One of the biggest mistakes one can make in ancient Greece, as far as I'm concerned. Eos asked him to grant Tithonus immortality. Zeus, known as the jealous type and a bit of a trickster, figured that he could probably grant her this one wish. However, as she didn't ask for eternal youth to accompany his immortality, Tithonus continued aging ever on. Eventually, he became so old that he couldn't even move, but he also couldn't die. Out of pity, Eos put him in a room alone where he just sits around babbling endlessly. In some later versions of the myth, she eventually turns him into a grasshopper or sometimes a cicada, depending on the rewrite. Immortality is only really useful when one can use this long life to its fullest extent. When, after a set amount of time, you basically turn into a gelatinous bone sack, you can be immortal all you like, but it's more a curse than a blessing. So I think we can confirm this form of immortality sucks. And because I want to bang one of your multiple wives, I am turning you immortal. You're Zeus, right? Yeah, I'm Zeus. Zeus from the turning into animals to screw various life forms school of life? Yeah. Yeah, that's Zeus. Even when the life form wasn't particularly into it? I mean, even though you already have a wife right now, look, we're not... second wife, because you turned your first wife into a fly and ate her after she helped you save your siblings from Kronos. She was going to have a very strong son, and my ego is incredibly fragile, okay? The same Zeus who refused to give humanity fire out of sheer pettiness. The same Zeus who gave Pandora the great blessing of curiosity while giving her a box which you explicitly told her not to open, something you knew she couldn't do because of the blessing you just gave her. That's Zeus. That's Zeus. Yeah, you can keep your blessings, buddy. It wasn't my fault. Everybody loves me. Honestly, why does anyone worship this guy? But this terrible type of immortality is not the only kind, of course. There's also immortal, but not invulnerable. That one's pretty self-explanatory, I'd think, but it basically means, with eternal youth in the bargain, you will not die, but you will be hurt. And that doesn't mean that you'll get shot and instantly die. No, you will just get hurt. You can't die. No matter how much pain you're in, you will simply continue suffering for the rest of your immortal, unnaturally long life. This particular immortality appears in a Twilight Zone episode, as do two others we'll discuss shortly. The Twilight Zone just really likes to talk about immortality. This episode appears in my least favorite Twilight Zone era, the 2002 one, but it's simultaneously my favorite episode of said era, One Night at Mercy. This episode revolves around a doctor working himself to near death. One night, roll credits, the patient that rolls in is Death himself. Death apparently tried to hang himself because he's had enough of having to play his role as Death, but it doesn't work because he's Death, and Death is immortal. So instead, he proclaims that he quits. He will just stop doing his job. No one will die again. That means everyone in the world is now immortal. The consequences of that decision become apparent soon enough when a group of scorched bodies is wheeled into the hospital. They're all flatlining, they're all technically dead, but they just won't die. They're just permanently on fire, permanently on the edge of death, never able to truly die. So the doctor pleads with Death to continue doing his job to stop their suffering. Death agrees, and the doctor dies, realizing now that the headaches he's been having were actually signs of an aneurysm. The only reason he didn't die earlier was because Death was on a holiday. Like the aging one, this is a pretty terrible curse. Could you avoid getting hurt or sick for a long time? Sure, but once you do get hurt, that's it. If you get into an accident of any kind that should by all accounts have killed you, you'll be in more pain than you'd ever hope to imagine. If you ever fell off a cliff to your not death, you'd just sit there at the bottom of a cliff, in pieces and a lot of pain. Okay, new offer. Immortality and eternal youth and— No! Okay, sorry. Our next contestant is the second episode of the Twilight Zone. This one is immortal and invulnerable, and again, we'll throw eternal youth into the mix. Nothing can hurt you. Nothing at all. Nothing can go wrong at that point, right? You're completely invulnerable. You can walk through the fire and the flame and emerge unscathed. What on earth could go wrong? In Escape Clause, the main character is offered exactly that. He's afraid of dying and wishes he wouldn't have to be sick all the time, and of course, that he'd never have to die. So the devil shows up to make him a deal. He would never die, nor would he ever suffer at all. But should he ever decide that he'd like to die after all, he'd only need to ask the devil. Of course, if he did use this escape clause, roll credits, the devil would keep his soul. The man laughs at that, wondering why he'd ever want to die, and goes off to get into all kinds of shenanigans. Soon enough, he gets bored of throwing himself in front of trains, and because of said boredom, he decides to accidentally throw his wife off a building because he thinks he'll get the electric chair for doing so. He'd like to try that chair for giggles. So he phones the police and gets his trial remarkably quickly, except he doesn't get the electric chair. He gets life in prison. The guard laughs at him. He's not all that young, he says to the main character. He wouldn't be there for too long. Little did he know. It hasn't even been a month, and he already uses his escape clause to get out of this terrible situation. Being immortal and invulnerable sounds like a pretty solid deal, right? But this man not only got bored in mere minutes, but he also found himself in a situation that saw him unable to do anything with his newfound immortality. After some time, he'd certainly be found out as being immortal, but by then he'd merely be turned into a circus attraction. Immortality doesn't grant him any other special powers. No super strength, no flight. They just exist for a very long time. Of course, if he hadn't gotten himself into this situation, things might have been different. However, that isn't necessarily a good thing either. In the legend of the Niño, a fish-like creature with the head of a monkey, it is said that if one eats the flesh of a Niño, it would bestow immortality upon that person. However, people rarely attempted to even catch a Niño because they were known to curse those who tried. And even when one simply washed up on shore, it was seen as a bad omen. One of the most famous stories that involve a Niño was Hapyaku Bikuni. The story tells about a fisherman in Wakasa province who caught a Niño and then tried to prepare it for his friends. However, one of his guests saw the head of the fish looked like that of a human and warned the others not to eat it. So, during dinner, the guests all secretly wrapped the food in paper so they could hide it under their clothes to throw out later. Except for one man. He was too drunk to throw away the fish, and when he came home, his young daughter demanded a present, so he gave her the fish. He came to his senses too late to stop his daughter, and she ate the whole fish. Since nothing bad seemed to happen, the man thought he'd overreacted and forgot about it. Years later, the girl grew up and married, but after that, she simply stopped aging. She stayed youthful while her husband grew old and died. From then on, the girl kept marrying, only to find herself widowed time and time again as her husbands grew old. So she decided to become a nun who wandered the land until she finally returned to Wakasa, where she took her own life at 800 years. Okay, listen. You'll like this one. You're human, you eat food. Okay, so there's this fish. Zeus? Yes? Go away. So I can offer you an escape clause of sorts that just far away. Okay, yeesh. This woman had what's likely considered to be the best version of immortality. Never getting hurt, eternal youth, eternal never dying, I suppose. And yet, she still decided to leave at 800 years. Because sorrow over that amount of time is not something any of us can truly imagine. Imagining that your loved ones around you die before you do, no matter what happens. Everyone you have ever befriended, ever cared for, will always die before you leave this earth. And that is not something I think any of us can really live with. At least she definitely couldn't. But this woman, unlike the man who sold his immortal soul to gain immortality, just ate a fish. She didn't even choose to be immortal, so she still had a way out. She decided on her own that after 800 years, it had been enough. Kind of like the next guy on our list, although involuntarily.
The final Immortality Twilight Zone episode is Long Live Walter Jameson. This character's immortality revolves around simply having eternal youth. They can still be hurt, they can be killed by basically any conventional means, he'll just never die of old age. So, Mr. Walter Jameson, roll credits, lives his life reasonably happily, marrying new women left, right, and center. Except, unlike the lady in the Niño story, Walter doesn't wait for them to die before he moves on to the next. So, one day, before his next victim gets to run away with this handsome immortal, one of his old wives shows up. She figured out what was going on, that this young man was her ex-husband, so she decided that she wasn't going to let anyone else get hurt by this scumbag, and she shoots him. The downside to this immortality is probably obvious enough. You're not really immortal. You've only really defeated one aspect of death, age. Which I suppose isn't really immortality in the purest sense of the word, more ageless, as it were. It's roughly on the same level as another form of immortality, the immortal but there's a price kind. Vampires who have to drink blood or they will still die, or Dorian Gray, a man who only lives forever by virtue of letting a painting of his person age instead of him. But the story seems to imply that with that, he lost his soul to the painting as well, because he becomes the world's biggest scumbag in a matter of moments. When he eventually does come to his senses, he destroys the painting and immediately dies.
So this painting that...
Why are you still here?
Ungrateful brat. Most types of immortality still leave plenty of room for pain and suffering and death in various forms. Honestly, the best way for immortality to happen is like the story of the Niño. You never die, you never age, you don't get sick, you don't feel pain, and eventually you make your own escape clause. You decide when to leave, because even if you have this best kind of immortality, there's still an expiration date on it at some point. At least the girl in the story seemed to think so. In her case, 800 years. Watching our loved ones die around us isn't something we can do for a very extended amount of time.
But that hasn't stopped humanity from trying to find immortality in practically every century so far. The most well-known Western story of the quest for immortal life is likely the Philosopher's Stone. Not the Sorcerer's Stone, that's a very silly name. In many versions of the tale of the stone, Nicholas Flamel is mentioned. However, the actual existing Nicholas Flamel wasn't even an alchemist, and alchemy was required to create this particular magic rock. Alchemists the world over had sought a way to create the Philosopher's Stone for many years. It was not only said to create the elixir of life through powdering the thing, but it also held the power to turn base metals into gold or silver. Imagine that! Eternal life and all the money one could dream of. So how did Flamel manage to create this sought-after treasure? Well, he didn't. Accounts of his eternal life were greatly exaggerated, as one might say, as he died at roughly age 87. And again, he wasn't even an alchemist to begin with. However, he was a very nice guy, which might have caused a man named Arnauld de la Chevalerie to write about Flamel's grand adventures as the creator of the stone. It was a Flamel fanfic, if you will. Although the source of the story was questionable at best, Flamel's legend grew as people started reporting sightings of Flamel in later centuries. Of course, as Flamel was buried with plenty witnesses to testify, those sightings were likely fake. I know, shocking. But the Philosopher's Stone wasn't the only magical immortality item of this kind. In some countries, people thought that eating jade or gold and even mercury or sulfur would elongate your life. I don't need to tell you that it does quite the opposite. There's also Amrita, a term you might have initially heard of in the game Nioh, if you weren't familiar with it before that. Although Nioh takes place in Japan, Amrita is actually an Indian term that means immortality, and it was initially churned up from the bottom of the ocean through the combined strength of gods and demons. The gods then drank the Amrita to achieve knowledge and power, as it does in Nioh, which in turn granted them their immortality once more. Although Japan has their own immortality myth in the Water of Life story, it was said that the moon god Tsukuyomi once decided to give man the water of life, poured from the waters of rejuvenation, and the serpents the water of death. But as you know, were not immortal. The person she had entrusted with the task of carrying the water down to earth got a little tired on the way there and had to take a break. While he's resting, a serpent takes a bath in the water of life, rendering it unusable. This is why serpents shed their skin, rejuvenating themselves as it were, but humanity is doomed to die. Weirdly, the snake theme comes back in the Epic of Gilgamesh as well, another story of a man on a journey to immortality. Gilgamesh is eventually gifted a herb that would grant him eternal youth, but when he takes a break for a moment to take a bath, a snake slithers over to eat the herb. I think the takeaway here is, don't take breaks, which is not a very good lesson at all. Unrelated, but do snakes bother you at all? No, but you do. Well, what if I give you this snake and a tasty herb? If I take the snake, will you never bother me again? I will firmly consider it. Go away, Zeus. Foiled myself again.
The list of things to eat to make you immortal is honestly almost endless. The ambrosia, the golden apples, or in the case of Sun Wukong, you'll eat no less than 3 immortality foods? Peaches of immortality, heavenly wine, and pills of longevity. Just to make sure, I guess.
Thankfully for immortality lovers the world over, immortality does technically exist for real, just not in humans or ingestible by humans to gain immortality. Bristlecone pine trees can live on for thousands of years, as can coral reefs, but one of the more interesting creatures is the Hydra. You probably know this term from the mythological Lernian Hydra from Hesiod's Theogony, a multi-headed serpent who, in later tellings, had the ability to regenerate his heads once they were cut off. But the Hydra does exist in our very real world, it's just not a giant serpent. It's a tiny creature that has the ability to clone itself in order to procreate, as well as the ability to simply regenerate parts of their bodies when they get hurt. You can see why it was named after the mythical Hydra. When scientists looked into these regenerative abilities, they found that a gene called the FOXO was the reason the Hydra didn't really age either. FOX proteins have multiple roles within our body and growth, but 2 of them are cell growth and longevity. Important when talking about immortality, no doubt. FOXO3 proteins specifically are thought to perhaps influence lifespan in general. And yes, we, the people, also have this protein. We just can't clone ourselves or regenerate limbs, unfortunately. Another, even more extreme example is the Teretopsis dorni, also known as the immortal jellyfish, which, yes, is a little bit on the nose. The immortal jellyfish is one of the very few creatures able to reach full maturity, only to revert back to their childlike state afterwards. When they become stressed or sick or just too old in general, they revert to avoid that situation through transdifferentiation, which basically means it transforms its old cells into young cells again. It's a little more complicated than that, but for simplicity's sake, eternally young. They're only really vulnerable to death directly while in their polyp stage, not fully mature yet. So if we were to translate this to human biology, you can only kill someone while they're a baby, which is a little dark, I know. So are scientists looking into these 2 versions of immortality in order to finally grant humanity the longevity we so clearly deserve? Well, yes, but they're not really getting anywhere. Yet. On humans. In 2015, some scientists managed to stop worms from aging by just turning off the aging process altogether. Even before that, in 2014, it was found that infusing old mice with young mice blood could reverse some of the aging in various organs. Does that sound incredibly Elizabeth Bathory bathing in the blood of young virgins? Yes, it does, doesn't it? In 2005, we thought we'd start being immortal in 25 years, which would be 2030, so in another 10 years, I suppose we'll see. Hey, so it's been a while, and I thought with science... Oh no, they trusted you with science? Well... Who the hell trusted you with science? Elon Musk. Of course. He said it would be a good meme. Get out. That's not very cash money of you.
To achieve immortality, we'd likely have to rewrite our entire gene pool completely. But that still hasn't really answered our question. Is immortality good, actually? When you Google the population of Earth, you are met with one of the most linear graphs you have ever seen in your entire life, from roughly 1960 to now. Yeah, Earth's population is on a steady rise and always has been. Now imagine if none of those people ever died.
If we were to achieve immortality at all, we wouldn't be invulnerable. I think it's safe to say that our version of immortality would only ever be the eternal youth kind. When and if it becomes available, it would also only be available to the rich people of this planet. Those gold-hoarding dragons that do not care for the well-being of anyone or anything save their offshore bank account, and they would be able to continue hoovering up more money for all eternity. If you thought the gap between rich and poor was big now, then immortality will really cook your goose. On top of that, how does retirement work at that point? Does everyone just work forever? Or do we finally switch to a Wall-E type society where robots do everything for us and we just do whatever we want? We would absolutely have to eat the rich before that happens because we all know they wouldn't allow it. Does it feel like I have an axe to grind? Because I do. Of course, the most obvious problem would simply be space. The population wouldn't immediately double, but even if only a small percentage of the world decides to have children, those are all permanent. Eventually, we would actually literally run out of space. So before we can all become immortal, we'd first have to find an inhabitable planet to relocate to. Are we the Zerg?
Are we the baddies?
It's doubtful we'll ever evolve into just being immortal, so it's going to have to be a conscious choice if it ever happens. If I was the only one, I don't think I'd ever choose immortality. I would just miss my friends and family too much. If it was everyone, then maybe, but honestly, mostly just to observe the chaos, as it were. So, would you want to be immortal? I'll let you think on that while I quote my favorite vampire while he talks about regeneration, extreme regeneration, and the lack thereof in humanity.
Yes, indeed, said the vampire, impervious to the derision. Your mutated race is capable of regenerating its fingernails, toenails, hair, and epidermis, but is unable to accept the fact that other races are more advanced in that respect. That inability is not the result of your primitiveness, quite the opposite. It's the result of egotism and a conviction in your own perfection. Anything that is more perfect than you must be a repulsive aberration. And repulsive aberrations are consigned to myths for sociological reasons.
You know what the problem is with immortality? It always gets out of hand. Take Wall Guy, for example. He got turned into a bird. Very big bird, but still a bird. And he wasn't necessarily happy about that. So, of course, what do you do when you're not happy? When somebody does something to you that you're not happy with? You go on a quest to kill them. So, of course, he goes along, picks up other immortals on his quest to help him with his quest. So, Robertson, for example, yeah. Giant shark. How does that work? Bird and a shark? I don't know, but it did. So now they're on a quest together. So they swim their way to a nearby dragon mountain, found a dragon, of course, Lochmuin, the immortal. Now we got 3 immortals, see? It's rolling out of hand, as I said. Nearby glacier, they find Coolsta, has multiple heads, and is immortal. Double, triple up. I mean, at this point, it's already an army, technically, but do they stop? Oh no, of course not. They're immortals. They never do. So they summon the monster cat, Septic, who is, yes, of course, also immortal. Then next, they travel on to the next round, find Mike Zweers, who is incorporeal and still immortal. How are you both? You can't be both. That's double up, and what did I say? It gets out of hand. So then Adrian Peckle joins the party, who is, by the way, pretty much the only human in the party at this point, except he has wings, but still more human than most of the other ones, right? So they fly, swim, run over to Olympus, where they find Ray Ray, who is now a 4-headed hellhound. Yeah, because they just wanted to outdo Cerberus somehow, and he's like, well, I'm here to kill Zeus because, you know, the whole immortal business, and everyone else is like, well, so are we! So they all cavort inside, eat Zeus. Yes, all of them eat Zeus. That includes the winged human. They're still immortal. Yeah, it didn't do anything, but they ate Zeus, which is nice. Go Immortals.